Well, welcome to this talk. I'm talking on the subject of religion and science, its history and interactions. I've been given slightly under 30 minutes, which is it's impossible, in fact, to talk about all of this. But I'm just trying to sketch a few important ideas, I think, that will be of relevance to the University of Juiz de Fora and the research being done at the university at the moment. So it's just a sketch out a few very general ideas. For myself, I have a history. I have a history of background in science as well as theology. I'm a Catholic priest, and I'm also a philosopher. But I started out in studying physics, high energy physics at CERN. We had several Brazilian scientists there, I mentioned in passing. And I spent several years smashing particles in Geneva. And then I spent several years working in business, including for the Brazilian company Banco Itaú. And I used to go to Sao Paulo quite often. Then I trained to be a priest, spent 7 years in seminary studying philosophy and theology, 4 more years studying philosophy, and now I'm back in Oxford again, studying at the Faculty of Theology and Religion. So I'm a great believer in being interdisciplinary, and that's one of the themes of my talk today. Initially, I just want to clear away some misconceptions. In Brazil, as in many countries, there's a widespread sense of a cultural war between religion and science. It starts from a very young age. Even children as young as 11 or 12, if you ask them, they will quite often say that religion and science are hostile. And even if they have no idea what these words mean, they will still say that religion and science are hostile. Now, in this presentation, I want to focus on deeper and I think more interesting issues. But it's important just to clear away some of the problems associated with this misconception. And it's quite easy to do this. I think we can just look at history and show that it's very possible to be a person of faith and a person of extraordinary intellectual and scientific achievement. So I want to just give very quickly some examples. And these also underline how enlightenment did not start with the French Revolution. And there's plenty of enlightenment going on before and afterwards. And these examples should encourage us to aspire to excellence in science and in the humanities. So I just produced some posters here. Obviously, Thomas Aquinas, master of all knowledge in the 13th century. His own works have been digitized. It was the first digital humanities project in history, in fact, and has something to say on every topic of knowledge in the 13th century. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun who was a polymath in Europe and helped to pioneer a lot of important work in psychology, as well as being a musician and a general advisor to the whole of Europe on all kinds of issues. Maria Agnesi, the first female professor of mathematics, appointed by a pope, Pope Benedict XIV, in 1750, and also a very devout Catholic, and published one of the first important books on calculus in Europe. Gregor Mendel, father of genetics, he bred 29,000 pea plants in his monastery and really invented the science of genetics. His work was almost forgotten for about half a century, and then rediscovered and really became the basis of biology today, and incredibly important. He's like the Isaac Newton of biology, and was a monk. And Georges Lemaitre, father of the Big Bang and modern cosmology. Sometimes I go to schools and a student will ask me how I could be a priest and believe in the Big Bang theory. I say, well, we invented it. We invented the Big Bang theory. One of the clergy invented it. And it took about 30 years to be accepted. And it was rejected in the Soviet Union because they said it is encouraging the clerics. So there is a history of science and religion. It's not always quite the history people believe it to be. And from these examples, we see that it is possible, to be a person of faith and a person of extraordinary achievement in science. Okay, that's all I'm going to say on that topic. I want to just say something else about the history of science and religion, because it is a very long history. Now, Professor Peter Harrison, a world expert on science and religion, has emphasized in a recent book that science and religion are 19th century words. The way we use these words today, these are 19th century words. But some of the content of what is covered by these words has been interacting over very long spans of history. And here's a famous example. So in ancient Greece, the notion of substance or essence, described by the Greek word ousia, developed from the study of the unity of living and growing things, like this man or this horse. So Aristotle, who invented biology, put a very great emphasis on the study of living and growing things and the unity of a living thing. He expressed by the term substance. In the 4th century of the Christian era, this word was also applied to the unity of the Father and the Son, incorporated into the Christian creed with the word homoousion, one being or consubstantial. And I've written here the words in Portuguese, consubstantial ao Pai. And this is absolutely central to theology. So here's an idea from the beginning of biology incorporated into theology, really the beginning of theology. So there's a long history of interaction of what is covered by the terms science and religion. And this has continued, though what is studied by science is constantly generating new resources for the imagination, and it's not uncommon for these resources to be applied to theology. But what is more problematic is when science triggers the adoption of a new worldview that can be challenging either for religion or for a particular conception of religion that has become dominant. And sometimes the religion needs to be reframed. Sometimes the scientific paradigm needs to be challenged, especially if it has become totalizing in the sense of nothing buttery. So paradigms, ways of looking at the world are very useful. There is a slight danger when they become total in the sense that nothing is accepted outside that framework. So when I was studying physics at Oxford, I was 18 years old, had a very clever professor, but he was of the view that if you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. If you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. Now, I would argue with him today, but I couldn't argue very easily at the age of 18. But you might say that his way of thinking was totalizing in the sense that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And that kind of attitude is something we do have to challenge. An important modern paradigm shift has been the change from the biological metaphysics of Aristotle, the ancient world, to modern Cartesian metaphysics with its many philosophical implications. So I want to just look at this very briefly. There is a revolution in the early 17th century from the philosophy of Descartes, who imagines the world like a box within which things move. And this became the dominant paradigm of the work of Newton in Newton's representation of the solar system. Very useful, extremely useful, but the box can become a bit of a trap, as I want to just illustrate. And you can actually see this change in art. So this is a picture before the transformation. And if you look carefully at the bottom of the picture, you can see that there are walls of the two cities being sketched out towards the base of the picture, and those walls have perspective. So this is clearly a picture with depth in the modern sense. However, the geometry of this picture is different to most modern art. So most modern art I'll show you an example. So let's move ahead. The Flagellation of Christ by Piero della Francesca. Here, everything, including the figure of Christ, is relativized within this box, this Cartesian style box. So the figures closest to us appear big, whereas the figure of Christ appears small. In the preceding picture, the size of the figures depends on their holiness. So this is holiness space. It's not Cartesian space. So the change from this picture to the next one represents a transformation in the way we're thinking about the world. And I saw this transformation lived out in practice in the city of Sao Paulo. And I worked for, as I mentioned before, I worked for Banco Itaú, part of it called Itaú Tech for some years. And I used to go to Sao Paulo a lot. And in Sao Paulo, every angle is a 90-degree angle. This is a Cartesian city. And the Cartesian framework is quite efficient for buildings, but it's not a transcendental framework. It doesn't point to what is beyond the natural. I just mentioned briefly that non-Cartesian thinking, teleology, has returned to some extent in biology and also in complex systems in physics. So there is end-directed action back again. This is not a Cartesian conception. And today, even aspects of mechanics look a bit more biological than they looked, say, 50 years ago. So there is a if you think of the way of thinking about the world as a pendulum, it swung from the biological to the mechanistic, but now it's swung back a little bit. And so teleology has returned to some extent. And we also see this in architecture. So Sao Paulo is not the last word in architecture. This is a new basilica being built in Barcelona, Sagrada Familia, and is very much inspired by living and growing things. So there's a return of biological metaphysics in architecture as well as in mechanics. As a general danger, there's always a risk of a representation replacing reality. Representations are very useful. The danger is when they replace the reality and then people declare there's nothing but the representation. And that is a challenge to religion, but it's also a challenge to humanity in general. If we see the world as nothing but assemblages of atoms in a box with a machine-like behavior, we'll think of ourselves as machines. Francis Crick said, "We are nothing but a pack of neurons." That's not a scientific statement, that's a philosophical statement. But he was using his authority as a scientist to make that statement, I think irresponsibly. W.V. Quine, to be is to be the value of a bound variable. That's again very Cartesian thinking. I don't think it's true, but obviously it's quite widely believed. And the danger is we come to resemble the idols of our own representations. Modern science, including modern physics, points beyond the Cartesian representation, the Cartesian box, but this fact is often forgotten today. And here's another nothing buttery statement. In popular culture, about 25 years ago now, there's a song which had the line, "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals." And there was a very rude second line, but it was encouraging us to behave like animals, not like people, not like persons in relationship. But the nothing buttery, that's not from the science. That's like a spin on the science, and we have to be careful about such things. So religion and science today. So we have investigated a great deal the biological worldview, and a great deal of work's been done, especially in response to evolution. So one example among many, you can read Alistair McGrath, Darwinism and the Divine. Alistair McGrath, Darwinism and the Divine. But there are many other books on this theme. And the mechanistic worldview, we've also studied religion and science in this framework as well. And it's particularly physicists who are keen on doing this. There's a long tradition in physics of playing with theological ideas. And Newton himself did this. He wrote more on theology than on science. And a modern example will be Paul Davies. So there's a lot of work being done in biology, a lot of work being done in mechanistic philosophy. But now I want to look at where I think the future lies with science and religion, the most important developments in science and religion. I think the new frontier will be persons and the study of persons in relationship. Persons are a bit mysterious, philosophically speaking. Philosophers argue a lot about moral issues connected with persons, and philosophers argue a lot about the extent of attribution of the term person. So one question, are all human beings also persons? Another question, are there human beings who are not persons at all, or only persons to a certain degree? Another question, could persons include some species of animals or possible machines? And this will impact on questions connected with artificial intelligence and so on. Persons are very hard to define. They don't fit into a Porphyrian tree. We can say man is a rational animal. We can't describe persons in the same way. Persons don't fit into that kind of structure. What we can say is persons must be at the heart of discussions of religion and science, because persons alone are capable of religion and of science. Now, here's one example from a modern biotechnology issue. Is this really a person? This is Ian Wilmot, who pioneered cloning with animals. And it's illustrative of the fact that the idea of the question of what is a person is difficult. And Ian Wilmot here was highlighting the difficulty. Excuse me a moment. In my own view, there's a great new opportunity today, a great metaphysical change, a new way of thinking about the world. And the focus is on the second person relationship. And the pioneer of this work was Martin Buber, who wrote a book, I and Thou, and he described it, I think rightly, as a Copernican revolution. This is a I call it a challenge to Descartes. Descartes famously said, I think, therefore I am, putting I at the center. But Martin Buber says, it's not I, it's I and thou together. That's where everything starts for human beings. And the beautiful thing today is that there's a great deal of new empirical data to look at with regard to this relationship. Psychologists study this kind of phenomenon under the term joint attention or shared attention. There's a lovely book here by Naomi Allen and her colleagues, Joint Attention, Communication and Other Minds. And this is taking some of the ideas of Buber, we're really investigating them in an empirical context, and particularly looking at situations where the I-thou relationship is atypical or attenuated. Autistic spectrum disorder is an example. But so children with autistic spectrum disorder are teaching us a great deal about this I-thou relationship. Now, anyone with a child will know that children love to interact, and they love to do things like this, share awareness of shared focus, sharing an attitude towards the thing or event in question. And this kind of interaction of shared awareness, of shared focus, is so fundamental to child development. It happens with adults as well, but it's not so obvious as with children. And shared attention is everywhere, joint attention is everywhere. So the wife of a friend of mine, Ignacio Silva, had a daughter, and there's a daughter behaving like her mother, actually imitating her mother, and trying to share awareness of shared focus at a conference. And here's another example of shared awareness or shared focus. Children point a lot. Children with severe autistic spectrum disorder don't point, or don't point so much. So it is pointing is an invitation to joint attention. And there's growing evidence that this kind of interaction of I and thou is incredibly important in the formation of thought, in the formation of language, and in the formation of ethics. There's some beautiful experiments in all these areas. For example, a child cannot learn language simply by watching television. A child has to learn language in the context of being able to act things out, being able to play, engaging in shared awareness or shared focus. So it is so important, this interaction. And this is an incredibly important kind of interaction in the Judeo-Christian tradition, because the revolution, particularly highlighted in the history of the Jewish people and in the Christian faith, is shared awareness or shared focus with God, second person relatedness with God. And this is an example taken from Augustine's Confessions. And these kinds of words we would never find in a pagan philosopher like Aristotle. So though Aristotle says there's a God, Aristotle never talks about God in this kind of language. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and new, late have I loved you. Very strong I-thou relationship. And really, the whole history of Christianity is about that relationship, that I-thou relationship with God. Of course, art already knows this. And here's Michelangelo's finger of Adam, pointing to the finger of God. But you can find many, many other examples in art. So we're just catching up with our artistic tradition. And I think this whole way of thinking about theology is very valuable. A few years ago, I used this approach of shared awareness, shared focus, to interpret Aquinas' virtue ethics. This is an amazing step forward in theology, because we've not really understood Aquinas until now on this topic. And there's a beautiful interpretation of his work in terms of shared awareness, of shared focus. This can really revolutionize virtue ethics in general. Just a couple of years ago, Professor Eleanor Stump in the United States also used the second person perspective to reinterpret the Christian doctrine of atonement, very much in terms of the healing of damaged second person relatedness, damaged relations to God, damaged relations to other people. And she has a very wonderful and novel approach to the atonement based on the second person relationship. So I think it's very fruitful for theology. And so I put it to you that the future of science and religion, I think the most interesting area will be on the person. We've done biology a lot. We've done religious science from the point of view of physics, a mechanistic worldview. We've done that a lot. But the whole new frontier, whole new frontier will be the personal perspective, the second person perspective. And we've only just started. There's a lot of work still to be done. There are all kinds of topics I look at and others could look at, looking at ideas in theology, but drawing in new findings from psychology, neuroscience, and other fields where we can learn about the second person relationship. And applying those ideas to theology, we can often make tremendous progress or understand things in new ways, in very fruitful ways.